morning to all viewers of today's webinar. My name is Muhammad Arif Azmi. I've been a legal practitioner for almost 6 to 7 years. Particularly in these few years of practice, I have been doing defamation cases, amongst other cases, criminal cases, and also cases in regards. Sorry, there was a echo. My practice has actually just started last year. So I've been doing all these types of cases, and one of them is defamation.
Okay, thank you. So, as our topic is Defamation Act 1957, so before we look further into Defamation Act 1957, can Mr. Arif give the general ideas on what does actually this act?
Okay, if we're going into actually what the act means, it's basically in essence an act that governs the law of defamation in Malaysia. Alongside beside the cases, because we have to understand defamation is actually a common law type of act, because when we drafted the Defamation Act, we looked at it alongside the English Defamation Act of 1954. So it was enacted with a view to protect the public from being targeted by individuals and companies from acts which can damage the reputation of the public. So this would also include unprofessional media practices conducted by irresponsible media practitioners in Malaysia. Now, interestingly, defamation is not defined in the Act itself, but a number of defamation cases have given us guidelines as to what it actually means. So generally, when we say Defamation Act, we are talking about defamation, which is basically when, in general, defamation is when some statement lowers a person's reputation in the minds of right-thinking member society or causes a person to be exposed to contempt, hatred, or ridicule, or it belittles a person's profession, calling trade or business.
Okay, so we understand the meaning of Defamation Act. Then, in general, how a statement will published by someone can claim as defamation is that a certain point need to be found to charge a person.
Yes. So basically, in general, when we're talking about defamation, such as in the case of Datuk Musa bin Hitam, the court viewed that the thought of defamation arises when there is a publication which has a tendency to lower a person's reputation or to cause him to be shunned or to be avoided by reasonable persons in society, thereby adversely affecting his reputation. Now, if we're talking about defamation, we have to understand there's actually two types, civil defamation and also criminal defamation. Now, in the penal code, actually, they have defined criminal defamation, which is whoever, in section 499, whoever by words, either spoken or intended to be read, or by signs or by visible representations, make or publishes any imputation concerning any person intending to harm or knowing or having reason to believe that such imputation will harm the reputation and shall also be liable to fine of such person is said, except in the cases hereinafter accepted, to defame the person. So generally, I would say that if one states that something in writing or through any medium that would lower another person's reputation, that would be defamation.
Okay, but as you mentioned that we have libel and slander, can you give us some example of that?
Okay, so when we're talking about defamation, of course, there's ways of categorizing it, and amongst those are libel and slander. So the biggest differences is, okay, if we're talking about libel is basically defamation in a permanent form, and is usually visible to the eye, such as in writing or in the newspaper. Emails can also be considered as libel, and pictures. But we have to take in mind, in Section 3 of the Defamation Act, it also states that the broadcasting of words via radio communication is also treated as libel. So the biggest difference is libel is actionable per se, meaning to say that you do not need to prove any damages to begin a claim in libel defamation. And this is because the law assumes that if your reputation is smeared via this libel defamation, then there are damages to the claimant. And the court assumes that there's going to be some form of damages that will be accorded to the claimant itself, because he will be damaged by this defamation. But when we talk about slander, on the other hand, now that slander is a temporary or transient form type of defamation, meaning to say it is usually through words, spoken or gestures. Now, slander is biggest difference with libel is that it is not actionable per se. You actually need to prove that there is some damages that has occurred due to that slander. You have to show that you actually suffered damages. There are exceptions, of course, such as in Section 4 of the Defamation Act, which states that slander to women do not need the claimant to prove special damages as a result of, because in Section 4 it states that if a person imputes unchastity or adultery to the woman, then even if it was slander, then it will be counted as defamation. Yeah, so those are basically the two differences of slander and libel.
Okay, then now let's say if there is someone is found to be convicted as defamation offense, what is the type of the punishment or penalty will given according to the Malaysian law?
Okay, so basically, when we're talking about defamation offense, we have to understand that, like I said just now, previously, that actually there are two types of defamation, which is civil and criminal. Now, criminal cases are very clearly stated in Section 500 of the Penal Code, which states that if found liable for criminal defamation, there is a punishment of imprisonment of up to 2 years or with a fine or both. So this is like criminal. We're talking about civil mostly because right now we're talking about the Defamation Act. So in civil cases, historically, cases right now since the year 2000 and above, it usually follows around the lines of 100,000 and above, and it can reach up to the millions, because there is actually no hard fast rule in regards to the assessment of damages, which a plaintiff can actually get in a defamation suit, because there are many factors that come into play when we're looking into how much actually the claimant can claim, and those factors include like the position of the claimant himself, the plaintiff, and its standing in society. For example, if we take a random person, just a normal worker at work, and somebody makes a defamatory statement at work against them, that the position and standing in society would not be as high as if it was a celebrity, say for example, an actor or actress, and then suddenly somebody comes out and says that person is such and such. So in regards to position and standing in society would affect the amount of damages that the plaintiff or claimant can actually get. So the other thing is the seriousness of the defamation itself. How serious is it that we're saying? For example, if I'm saying, oh, he did not pay the parking ticket, so that isn't as bad as saying, oh, actually that guy is a criminal. This actually happened to the late Datuk Kapal Singh, where, for example, there was an allegation that Kapal Singh had actually committed a crime under Section 420 of the Penal Code. So what happened then was that there was an issue, of course, in regards to, like if we say Kapal Singh was alleged to have committed Section 420 of the Penal Code. So in general, standing society, most people wouldn't know what that actually means. 420 is basically cheating, and if the members of society, such as lawyers, were to understand what that means, then that will also impute some defamation in regards to the lawyer itself. So that is more serious than something like saying, "Oh, he didn't pay the parking ticket and whatnot." And the other thing is, a few other things are mode and extent of the publication. Like if you post it in a group WhatsApp group of like 3 people, and then only those 3 people are the ones who seeing, and compared to if you post it on, like, for example, Facebook or TikTok or any social media post, and you are actually broadcasting it to a larger audience. So the question of how many people actually saw that post would also be a factor in regards to knowing how much damages can they actually claim, and also issue of malice, whether or not when they did the post, what was the intention? Was it really oh, I really don't like this guy, I want to make him look bad and whatnot?
Yeah.
So that's why I'm posting it. Then that would show malice on the part of the defendant, then that can increase the assessment of damages. Another thing is whether or not there was an apology, of course. For example, if somebody defames you and then suddenly he makes apology, that does not abscond that person from liability, but it might mitigate the damages awarded to the plaintiff, because when there's an apology, it would seem like there's some sincere effort on the part of the plaintiff to try to actually restore the plaintiff's part in regards to his reputation. So when we're talking about how much the court allow for in regards to damages, yes, it will really depend on a lot of factors. But we have to understand that when we're talking about defamation, the idea is that this person's reputation has been smeared, or this person's reputation has been lowered in society. So the court will try its best to put the plaintiff back into a position, not exactly back into the position, or try to give some damages in trying to put him back in that position, as if the post was never put. So these are the things that the court will be looking at in regards to assessing damages to give to the claimant in the Defamation Act.
Okay, Mr. Arif, can you share some of your experience in previous case about the Defamation Act in court? Something like this, the case that you can unforgettable or you faced. Can you share with us?
Okay, so generally when we're talking about cases, of course I wouldn't go into detail for obvious reasons, but basically most of my cases nowadays actually have a lot to do with social media, with the rise of internet. So my experience shows that's actually a trend of cases involving social media posts which are defamatory in nature. So when we're talking about social media, we're thinking about Facebook, we're talking about Twitter. So all these things, they are actually opening up new doors for defamation suits to come up. Like we say, keyboard warriors and whatnot. So the biggest issues to keyboard warriors is whether or not we can ascertain who is actually the poster of those defamatory statements, of course. But when we're talking about my experiences so far, I think if there was like 10 cases, I think 8 or 9 are in regards to social media cases. So it's like people posting on Facebook saying, "Oh, this person is such and such, which is interesting because in previous times, these cases never existed because internet wasn't there. So when we're talking about modern defamation cases, it's always regarding social media. So we have to be really be careful of any post that we do, because these things might seem like you can say whatever you want, but I always say you have freedom of speech, but you really don't have freedom after your speech, because once you post something, if it is defamatory, you can one day you can get into a defamation suit. Somebody will say, "Hey, you're talking about me," and then they file a suit, and then you're stuck, because these defamation cases are quite expensive, to be honest. So we have to be careful of our posts online. But my previous cases, that's usually how it is lah. Usually when you feel angry towards somebody, you feel like you don't agree with them or something, you can post, but be careful not to defame that person, because this is an issue of, if you have opinions, that's a different thing. But if you are going against that person personally and trying to make him his reputation, you want to smear his reputation, then that might be defamation lah. So that's how usually my cases go lah. And what I'm trying to do is, because I've initiated cases and I've also defended clients. So basically, when I'm looking at it, is sometimes, to be honest, the claimants, they are not really looking into monetary compensation. Sometimes they just want that person to apologize, because if you post something defamatory, that person will be their feelings will be hurt. They will feel mentally troubled. So all they want is just a simple apology. But sometimes even my clients might have some trouble, looking at it, because we lawyers, we can tell them, actually what you posted is somehow like saying defamation, but if you try to apologize, that might mitigate it later on. But of course, it would depend on the case lah. Not all cases we say that they should apologize, because once you apologize, you are admitting to the defamation itself. So in my cases, usually I would definitely look into what their postings are and really go into depth with them in regards to what's actually defamation, and I can tell them up front, okay, this is actually a defamatory statement. I would suggest you do this, but usually they don't necessarily follow, of course. So these are the things that we're looking at when we are doing defamation cases, especially in Malaysia lah.
Okay, so if okay, for Mr. Arif, is there any challenge if someone they sued on Defamation Act and they want to escape from the legal punishment?
Okay, so if we are trying to avoid being sued or not sued, meaning to say they have been sued and they are trying to escape defamation, right? So if we're talking about that, most often than not, they would have to rely on certain defenses in regards to defenses to defamation, we call it. Because once you can prove a few of these defenses, such as defenses of justification, which means that you can prove that defamatory statement was actually true, or you can also prove that as like absolute privilege. For example, if the defamation occurred during parliamentary hearing, or if it was done in a police report, those can be counted as absolute privilege. And even if it's like fair comment, meaning to say that sometimes journalists, they do all these postings and whatnot, and they've done all their research and everything, and after doing all that, they found that these are some of the comments that they could make. Those can fall under fair comment. So the challenges of a person trying to escape the punishment of Defamation Act is, of course, trying to wiggle their way out of saying that actually there could be defamation, but actually they have proven some defenses in regards to it, and they can actually escape liability by proving defenses to this defamation.
Okay, just now, Mr. Arif said that the element of charge is Defamation Act. So there are only 3 elements in this Defamation Act, or there are some more in this element?
Okay, so there's actually a few thoughts in regards to this. Some people say there are 4, some say there are 5, but actually the main ones are actually 3. So technically, when we're talking about these elements in defamation, there are the 3 most quoted ones are: the first, that the words must be defamatory. So meaning to say that it has to make people read it or see it and feel like, oh, actually this person isn't that person I thought he was, or makes people question their standing in society, make them feel that their reputation has actually been destroyed or reduced. So words that are defamatory, like the case that I mentioned just now in Kapal Singh's case. Once somebody says something that is makes people think, oh, he's actually a crook. Because if you're saying a lawyer is a criminal, then you're basically putting him very low, because he's supposed to be somebody who is respected in society, somebody who has integrity, somebody who wouldn't do these things, basically. So if you're saying that a lawyer is a criminal, then you're basically saying that he shouldn't be a lawyer, that he isn't supposed to be respected, all these imputations from that defamatory statement. So in these allegations, if the words are defamatory, then the first element, which is the words are defamatory, has been proven. So then there is a second element, which is the words must refer to the claimant or the plaintiff. So when we're saying that it must refer to, because the thing is, sometimes not all defamatory statements specifically mention the claimant. There are also instances where they're saying that, oh, my neighbor is such and such and such and such, he did this and that. But then the question goes, does it refer to the plaintiff? So that actually, it depends on the situation. But generally speaking, if it mentions the claimant or the plaintiff, then definitely this element would have been established, because it needs to say that, okay, Ali so and so is the person who is doing all this nonsense, or doing all this criminal acts or whatnot. So we need that, the court needs to see that, did they really mention that person or not? Because there are cases where you do not mention that person's name, but by describing certain facts, people come to an expectation, come to a realization that actually, after reading all these facts, it's actually talking about another person. For example, like in Amber Heard's case, where the article that Amber Heard made, even if it does not mention Johnny Depp, but if he's saying ex-husband, he's saying that, those facts can actually impute another person, and that person can, if people read it, people know, oh, it's actually talking about him. Then it can be constituted as referring to the claimant, which is the second element. So then the third element would be the words have been published. So basically, this means that the words or materials disseminated to a third party other than the plaintiff. Because if you think about it logically, if those defamatory statements were not made to any other person, for example, if you post it in your blog but nobody reads it, then how can it be a defamatory statement? So now, of course, if they post it on, like, for example, a blog, it might be said that, oh, anybody could read it, right? But in another way is that, for example, if they post it in a WhatsApp group that there's only like that person there and the plaintiff, or like a conversation between them, then that wouldn't be a defamation, because there's no third party in this whole transaction. So as long as a third party has actually seen or read or looked at the defamatory statements, then the third elements would have been established. So basically, these three elements are needed to prove defamation.
Okay, then how about the limitation period to bring a definition of act? I mean that if if I want to sue someone after 1 month, is that because he harmed my reputation? So how about the limitation period?
Okay, defamation is actually a tort or a wrong. Meaning to say, it's a tort of defamation lah. In Malaysia, any limitation is in general. We have to look into the Limitation Act 1953. Now, in I can't remember the exact section, but basically it prescribes that 6 years, any wrong of torts must be initiated within 6 years from the date that the action accrued. Meaning to say that if I posted it today, if the defamatory statement is posted today, then there is a 6 years from that time where a person can actually initiate the suit in court. So we have to remember that lah. But when we're talking about criminal defamation, there's actually no limitation period. Meaning to say, it's really up open to the government to decide whether or not they want to charge someone for criminal defamation. But in regards to the Defamation Act, and if somebody wants to claim for a defamation suit, the Limitation Act says it's 6 years from the date of the action accrued.
Okay. Just okay. Like for example, if someone is passed away, and then he want to sue someone, but not in Defamation Act. But if he or she is still alive, then I want to help him or to sue the one of just defend, or she can help like the third party.
Sorry, meaning to say, so the person who made the defamatory statements passed away.
Yes.
I see. So the question is, how do you actually proceed with that?
Mm.
Okay, so basically, when a person passes away, in courts, what is needed to be done is that you will have to file against the estates of the deceased, meaning to say the next of kin, the partner, because of course, if you want to sue that person is no longer there, so there's nothing that you can do about that. Even in cases that are ongoing, if the defendant passes away, the claimant has to apply to court in order to substitute the person who passed away into the next of kin or the estate of the deceased. And other than that, it's generally basically the same. It's just that it might be a bit more difficult because you don't have the chance to actually ask the defendant in regards to his postings and why he posted. Other than that, is more or less the same.
Okay, just now, Mr. Arif explained about the absolute privilege, right?
Sorry.
Just
Yes.
yes. Then can you explain more about the qualified privilege and renal privilege and fair common influence to the judgment of result defamation?
Okay, so basically, when we're talking about defense, there's quite a number. I don't think I would be able to cover them all within this time, but basically, we can talk about the main ones: justification, absolute privilege, qualified privilege. I know Reynolds privilege and fair
Yeah.
common. So basically, like I said previously, defenses, if proven to exist, can have the ability to dissolve the maker of said defamatory statements from liability itself. Now, in other words, if you can prove that a defense is present, then the maker might not be found at fault. So, among those justifications, which is actually found in Section 8 of the Defamation Act, meaning to say that justification, like I mentioned just now, where if you can prove that those defamatory statements are actually true, then that defense could actually be found to be there. Now, absolute privilege can be found in Section 11, and is usually, like I mentioned just now, when it's connected to administrative system within the government. For example, when you lodge a police report to the police, that police report cannot be said to be a defamation because you are trying to do your duty in reporting a crime to the police in order for them to initiate a police investigation. But of course, there are a few cases recently that have found that actually not necessarily has to be absolute privilege if it can be found that when he lodged that report, it was done with malice, meaning to say that it was a false report. He just wanted, to make that person's life difficult, or he's lying or something like that. If you can prove those things, then defamation can still exist. But basically, absolute privilege is when, for example, when court gives its decision, in the judgment itself, because those are not instances where the posts were made to defame somebody. Those are reporting facts. For example, in court judgment, it mentions certain things that might show, it might look defamatory, but those are decisions of the court. and not defamation. So that under Section 11 can be found as under absolute privilege. Now, if we're talking about qualified privilege, these are like, for example, if you post in paper, newspapers, when you report a certain issue in the newspaper. This is actually found in Section 12 of the Defamation Act. So this is a defense where, for example, the question of responsible journalism comes into play lah. This is actually quite closely related to Reynolds' privilege, because now Reynolds' privilege is actually quite interesting because it's based on the English case of Reynolds and Times Newspaper Limited. So in which that case, the court decided that in establishing Reynolds' privilege, there are two requirements that the publication must be on a matter of public interest, and that the second one is the steps taken to gather, verify, and publish the information must be responsible. So Reynolds' privilege is where, for example, you want to post, you have actually published in a newspaper on a person or something that has occurred, and if that person can prove that when they did the statements itself, which might be defamatory, it was done with responsible journalism with those two elements present, then this particular defense can be found to exist. Now, if we're talking about fair comment, it is found under Section 9 of the Defamation Act. So fair comment is generally when you are actually talking about that person, but you are also commenting on that person. So these are usually, you use fair comment when it is your own observations. For example, you see your neighbor, he says something which is you feel that is if you post it anywhere, it might sound defamatory, but you are making comments. This person shouldn't be doing this. So it's just a comment, including facts. Then they will fall under fair comment under Section 9 of the Defamation Act. So if you can prove these defenses, there is a possibility to of course, absolve yourself from liability, but it would depend a lot on the cases itself, because actually it's very, all the defamation cases rely heavily on the facts of the case. So even if I let you know on all these defenses, it might sound like it's applicable to any certain cases, but there is no guarantee. You need to look into all the intentions of each post. For example, if we're talking about qualified privilege, because if you're doing all these postings in the newspaper, but you are trying to make that person look bad, and it's not responsible journalism, you are just trying to tarnish a person's reputation. So there's a lot into play when we're talking about defamation defenses. So these are among the things that we're looking at when we're talking about the aspects of defense.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Mr. Arif, as a lawyer, your opinion, Defamation Act effective and relevant to the apply in society nowadays in order to protect someone lost, and why?
Okay, so that's a good question. Is it effective? I would say to an extent. Is it relevant? I think it can be in the relevant circumstances, but you have to understand that defamation law is a constant balancing between a person's right to not be defamed against the other person's right to freedom of speech. Because in Malaysia, because we're talking about defamation law, it's balancing these two things. A person has the freedom of speech, and the person has right not to be defamed against another person. So in Malaysia, like we're talking about right to freedom of speech enshrined in Article 10, 1A of the Federal Constitution, which states that every citizen has the right to freedom of speech and expression. But we have to understand that, like I said just now, that comes with a limitation, because even if you have the freedom of speech, it doesn't mean that you can easily tarnish another person's reputation, or make defamatory statements and whatnot. This is actually seen in Article 10 2A of the Federal Constitution, which states that restrictions can be put in in order to prevent or provide against the contempt of court, defamation, or incitement by any offence. Meaning to say that these two come hand in hand. They have to exist because nobody can have absolute right to speech. So if we're talking about whether or not Defamation Act right now is relevant, because a lot of people are saying that isn't the Defamation Act going to prohibit the freedom of speech? It does not prohibit freedom of speech if it's done responsibly. There has to be an understanding that if you're making statements against another person, you have to be careful of what you say. This is more of understanding. It's just, I think it's logical that you have to be courteous and always be fair to the other person and not defame them. And so when we're talking about the Defamation Act, it has been tried and tested time and again. However, to be honest, its age is starting to show lah. Because when it was enacted, the internet was really far away. It was never near the time that they made the Defamation Act. Meaning to say, we're talking about right now, newspapers, unfortunately, we don't know how long newspapers will still be around. And right now, a lot of these newspapers are going online. So there's online newspapers, there's websites for newspapers, so people are looking there. And also now, social media gives rise to everybody has a has a method of actually posting their views, and if they want to say something, they can easily just open up their computer to actually just write anything they want. So these are actually new things that have not been considered during the time that the Defamation Act was made. Because if we look into the Defamation Act, it was more talking about radio broadcasting, talking about newspapers, but there's nothing about the internet and whatnot. So like I said, his age is beginning to show, but the problem is right now, if we're seeking to protect the losses of a person due to defamation, there needs to be some reform, some improvements, I would say. So of course, like we're talking about reform or improvements to the Defamation Act and whatnot. We know that the law is actually a living creature. It can change with time. But the thing that we have to do is that we have to pressure and push and show interest to our lawmakers that actually these are the things that we want changed. But if I'm being honest, right now, there's not much in regards to anyone pushing for these reforms to be made. Because as it is, the Defamation Act does its job quite okay. Even though there is no mention of the internet, there's no mention of Facebook or any social media on the Defamation Act, but it manages to protect the interest of people who are trying not to be defamed. Because even if if you want to file a suit for example, a defamatory statement on Facebook, there's nothing in the act stopping you from making that claim. And nowadays, even the courts have opened up specialized courts such as cyber courts in Malaysia, whereby only cases in regards to internet, cyber types of cases. For defamation cases, you can initiate your case in those courts. If we're talking about new age type of cases, and there's loads of cases in regards to Facebook posts and Twitter posts, even TikTok posts have managed to enter the court. So to say that the Defamation Act is not relevant or effective, I wouldn't be saying it be that far, but I believe that there is room for changes, of course, because nowadays, everything is modernized, and we are all a different society than when the act was made. So there could be some improvements to the act, but to say that the need for amendments is high, I don't think it seems that particularly pushed in today's society lah. So those are my views in regards to the Defamation Act lah. But like I said, the law is always constantly changing, and it reflects on the society's beliefs at the time. So if there are going to be changes, definitely it can be done.
Okay, Mr. Arif, just now you answer all my question. Is there any you want to explain more about this Defamation Act?
Okay, so we're talking about the Defamation Act. It is an act that was, like we mentioned just now, mainly to safeguard the public's interest in regards to being defamed. So in Malaysia, for example, a lot of these instances that occur that show that actually, like criminal cases, it's hard for people to gauge when can a defamation case start, because it would seem that there is an influx of new cases because a lot of things can seem defamatory. If you post something on WhatsApp, because it's very easy nowadays to defame somebody and not even realize it. If you post something, for example, oh, this so and so posted on a WhatsApp group saying that this person is not to be trusted or something bad lah, basically. Then if somebody reads that, that can open a room for defamation cases. But the other thing about defamation cases is that it's actually quite difficult to initiate these cases because it's quite expensive. Um, the range for initiating defamation cases can range from 20,000 to 30,000, and it can increase as far as the case goes on. So, meaning to say that there is actually a big place for defamation cases in Malaysia, but access to it is quite limited. But the problem is that there's since, like I said, the internet is there, anybody can just post anything nowadays. There's like keyboard warriors and such. So we're talking about defamation is actually bigger now than it was, because it used to be only looked at in regards to public figures. In defamation is in newspaper articles and whatnot. But now you don't need that far reaching to be stated to be defamation. Like I said just now, there are only three elements, and one of the elements is that a third party. There's no mention that you need to be at least 10 people have read it before you can initiate a case. Meaning to say, if you're saying that you posted and only like 100 people read it, it already opens a room for you to initiate a defamation case. But the question is, how much is it that you can actually get from it? That's a different question altogether. But defamation actually happens all the time. It's just that whether or not somebody initiates a case or not. That is the other thing. So when we're talking about defamation, actually, usually it's in regards to celebrities and whatnot. But now we are starting to see cases where just almost anybody can initiate a defamation case as long as they have the means to do it. So it's a bit dangerous, I would say, but that is how the law works. If you defame somebody, you have to be prepared to suffer from your defamatory statements, because you cannot go around just saying that somebody is so and so without having any liability towards what you said. Like I said, you have freedom of speech, but you do not have the freedom after it. So meaning to say, you have to always be careful of whatever you post online or anywhere.
Okay, that's a question for me. So I want to ask our audience, is there any question from your side? You can comment. We can read our question for our audience within 5 minutes. If not, we'll end the interview. Okay, Mr. Arif. I have one question from our audience, Nur Ilma Hamza. Mr. Arif, do you think that it's easy to file defamation case in Malaysia?
Okay. Um, Honestly speaking, like I mentioned before, to file a case is one thing. To actually succeed, okay, because if you file a case, it really depends on your course of action and whether or not it actually has actually followed all those elements that we mentioned. So to file a case though is another thing, because when you file a case, you never know the end of the case. You never know whether or not you will succeed or you will fail. So to answer the question is it difficult? Actually, no. It's very easy to file a defamation suit, and even if your case isn't that strong, you can definitely just file it in. But the question is, how much cost are you going to incur in order to initiate the case itself? Because the problem that I see is that sometimes when you are heated and you feel angry, and but you have the means, meaning say you have the ability to cough up the money to proceed with the case, you can definitely hire any lawyer to proceed the case for you. But we as lawyers, sometimes what happens is if I tell them, look, this case seems like it'll be a bit difficult to prove, for example, defamation. But if you want to proceed, we can definitely just proceed, because lawyers, what we do is that we follow uh, cases, we follow the client's instructions, meaning to say that if the client says, okay, let's proceed with a certain case, defamation case, even though I feel like maybe it's not that strong, but because the client had instructed us to proceed with the case itself, then we will have no issues in filing. But we have to let them know lah that actually we feel that it might be a bit difficult to initiate these cases. But to file is not difficult. All you need to do is just hire a lawyer, and they can definitely just file for you.
Okay, for the next question from Miss Amira Azmi, is there any case related to media practitioners that being sued?
Okay, so if we're talking about media cases, I would say that there are actually a few, but I cannot actually remember those cases. I can only remember that they do exist, particularly because, like, we're talking about defamation. Usually, it starts with newspaper articles and also radio broadcasting. But in Malaysia, unfortunately, I do not remember the case. I remember there is, but I don't remember the exact case. I need to come back with that lah. But basically, of course, there would be cases if we look them up, because it's not that difficult to publish an article on a certain topic or a certain person, and cause that person to be liable for defamation if it was posted on like newspaper and whatnot. So to say that any specific cases, I couldn't say, but I remember being some cases.
Thank you, Mr. Aris, and thank you, Miss Amira, for the question. Is there any question? I think that's all. So we come to the ending of our session. After asking so many questions in Defamation Act, we really appreciate Mr. Arif for willing to spend your time with us and for this talk. And before we end, can everyone turn on your camera? We want to take photo for the memories. So can we take photo? Miss Amira, can you take photo? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Arif. And
Welcome.
okay, we will end this section. Thank you so much for the participation. Thank you.